The rusty hinges of the Youngstown workshop shrieked like a dying animal as Frank threw his weight against the steel doors. But the cold October mist wasn't the only thing waiting for him inside. On his workbench sat a single white envelope, its crimson IRS stamp pulsing like a fresh wound against the blackened wood. As he tore it open, the silence was shattered by the heavy, rhythmic stomp of tactical boots and the metallic clatter of weapon bolts. A phalanx of masked men flooded the garage, their shadows stretching long and jagged over the machines his father had built his life on. Before Frank could utter a word, a strip of bright yellow tape was slapped across his primary lathe, branding his heritage as state property. He lunged forward, desperate to protect the iron, but a gloved hand slammed into his chest, sending him crashing into a rack of wrenches that rained down like shrapnel. Gasping for air on the oily floor, Frank watched as the bailiffs unrolled a document that didn't just demand money. It erased his existence. Somewhere in the city, the woman who held the keys to his heart and his bank accounts had stopped answering her phone, leaving him alone in a kingdom of grease that was being sold out from under him before the sun had even fully risen. The heavy steel bolt bit into Frank Connor's palms with a searing, morning chill. The metal felt like ice against his calloused skin, a brutal reminder of the October air settling over Youngstown. He gripped the handle, muscles tensing in his forearms as he threw his weight against the resistance of time and neglect. The rusty hinges of the main gates emitted a high-pitched, piercing shriek that sliced through the thick silence of the sleeping alleyway. It was a jagged sound, the scream of old iron protesting the start of another day. Outside, the mist clung to the ground like dirty cotton wool, a gray shroud that seemed to seep from the very pores of the crumbling brick buildings nearby. This fog crawled lazily into the yawning mouth of the workshop, its damp fingers reaching for the corners of the room. It settled in fine, microscopic beads on the blackened workbenches and the cold surfaces of the lathe. Frank inhaled deeply, drawing in the thick, familiar scent of aged wood shavings and heavy machine oil. This aroma had soaked into the brick walls over decades, a permanent record of the labor his father had started and he had continued. His boots struck the concrete floor with dull, rhythmic thuds, kicking up tiny plumes of dust that danced in the gray light. Reaching the wall, Frank flipped the master toggle switch. Above him, the long fluorescent tubes flickered convulsively, buzzing like angry hornets before humming into a harsh, clinical life. The sudden light carved the silhouettes of the heavy machinery out of the gloom, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. Frank rubbed his freezing hands together, the friction a small comfort as he prepared to breathe life into this frozen kingdom of iron and grease. Frank moved toward the battered blue mailbox bolted near the entrance. The metal groaned as he yanked it open, reaching for the stack of mail that had accumulated. He pulled out a handful of glossy junk, colorful advertisements for grocery chains and pizza joints that looked absurdly bright in this gray environment. Tucked between the flyers, a stark white official envelope caught the light. A bold, crimson stamp sat in the corner like a fresh wound. Frank's thumb grated against the paper, the sound of tearing cardstock echoing in the cavernous room as he forced the seal. Inside, a single sheet of paper bore the heavy crest of the Internal Revenue Service. The text was a blur of bureaucratic jargon until his eyes locked onto the numbers. Dry, black digits represented a debt underlined with a double stroke of finality. A sum with 6 zeros shimmered before him, the magnitude of the figure making his throat constrict. He swallowed hard, but his mouth felt like it was filled with ash. The paper trembled in his grip, the vibration traveling up his arm until a cold sweat began to prickle along his spine, chilling him despite the flannel shirt he wore. He read the word delinquent over and over, until the letters bled into distorted black blots on the page. An invisible band seemed to tighten around his neck, stealing his breath. Youngstown was a city of ghosts and ruins, and it felt as though the ruins were finally claiming him. Desperation fueled his movements as he fished the smartphone from the pocket of his tattered coveralls. His fingers, stained with the permanent grime of the trade, fumbled over the glass screen, scrolling rapidly through the contact list. He found the name Sarah and pressed the icon with enough force to nearly crack the display. He held the phone to his ear, pacing the length of the central aisle. The ringing was loud and maddeningly steady, a rhythmic electronic chirp that bounced off the cold, unresponsive walls of the shop. He pressed the plastic casing against his head so hard it creaked. After the fifth ring, the call cut to the mechanical, soulless voice of the automated greeting. Frank disconnected with a frustrated growl and dialed again immediately. His pulse thundered in his temples, a frantic drumbeat that drowned out the distant sounds of the waking city. He stared at the screen, where Sarah's smiling face looked back at him from the wallpaper. A photo taken during a better summer, a lifetime ago. A hollow, icy void opened in his chest as the second call went to voicemail. The peace of the morning shattered when a sudden, violent blow struck the main door. The sound of metal slamming against brick reverberated through the shop like a gunshot, making Frank jump. Before he could move, a phalanx of men in dark blue uniforms surged into the space, their patches identifying them as court bailiffs. Behind them came the heavy, rhythmic stomp of tactical boots. Armed guards in thick body ski and black masks moved with practiced precision, their faces hidden, their intent clear. The blued steel of automatic rifles caught the harsh fluorescent light as the guards fanned out along the perimeter of the shop, securing the exits. The lead bailiff, a man with a face like carved granite, strode toward Frank's primary workbench and dropped a thick, overstuffed folder onto the surface. A cloud of ancient dust billowed into the air. Without a word of greeting, the other bailiffs began unrolling rolls of bright yellow tape. They began slapping the adhesive strips across the lathes and the hydraulic presses, the crinkle of the plastic a sharp, invasive sound. Frank raised a hand in a weak, protesting gesture. But he was ignored as if he were a ghost. The air in the workshop, once smelling of oil, was now dominated by the scent of industrial plastic and the metallic clatter of weapon bolts as the guards settled into their positions. The lead bailiff pulled a document with an official seal from his folder, his expression unreadable. He jabbed a thick finger at a judge's signature at the bottom of the page. Frank's eyes scanned the bold headers: forced seizure and asset forfeiture. The paper smelled of fresh ink and the cold, sterile scent of a government office. He tried to process the paragraphs detailing his failures, but the lines of text swam and drifted like smoke. The official began a monotonous recitation of the inventory, listing the machines that now belonged to the state. Frank watched as they moved toward his favorite lathe, the one his father had taught him on. They smoothed a yellow strip across its cast-iron frame, the seal of the court looking like a brand. Each word the man spoke felt like a heavy stone dropping into the pool of Frank's consciousness, ripples of ruin spreading through his mind. His fingertips went numb, the world around him beginning to gray at the edges. This is a mistake. Frank finally found his voice, though it came out as a ragged, desperate shout. He stepped forward, his arms flailing as he tried to bridge the gap between him and the official. The taxes. Sarah handled them. She sent the wire last month. His face flushed a deep, angry purple, a thick vein throbbing in the center of his forehead like a living thing. The lead bailiff didn't even look up, his lips curling into a thin, dismissive line as he continued to check boxes on his digital tablet. Frank reached out, his hand clamping onto the bailiff's elbow in a frantic attempt to force the man to look at the payment confirmations on his phone. Spittle flew from Frank's mouth as he roared about the injustice of the system, his voice cracking with the strain. Blind rage began to cloud his vision, a red haze that narrowed the world down to the man in front of him. He was so consumed by the heat of his anger that he failed to notice the two guards on his flank. They began to close the distance, their gloved hands tightening around the grips of their heavy batons. As Frank made a sudden, lunging move toward a hydraulic press that was being taped shut, one of the guards reacted with explosive force. The man stepped in, delivering a powerful shoulder check directly into Frank's chest. The impact was like being hit by a low-flying bird. It drove the air from Frank's lungs in a single, agonizing huff. He flew backward, his boots skidding on the oily floor before his spine collided with the sharp edge of a metal shelving unit. The impact sent a cascade of wrenches and screwdrivers clattering to the floor, the metal raining down around his head. The guard stepped over him, planting a heavy boot inches from Frank's hand, effectively barring the way to the machines. Frank lay there, gasping for air that wouldn't come, the metallic taste of blood blooming on his split lip. Every shallow breath sent a jagged spike of pain through his ribs. Through a blur of involuntary tears, he watched as the final strip of yellow tape was smoothed over the controls of his shop, a bright plastic barrier between him and his life's work. Frank scrambled up and stumbled into the cramped, wood-paneled office at the back of the shop. His fingers, slick with sweat and shaking uncontrollably, fumbled with the dial of the heavy floor safe. The series of metallic clicks felt deafening in the sudden, oppressive silence that had fallen over the building. The heavy door finally swung open on its greased hinges. But instead of the expected stacks of ledgers and titles, Frank was met with a hollow, echoing void. He frantically yanked out the leather folders that were supposed to hold the year's financial reports. He shook them, but only empty plastic sleeves fluttered out, whispering as they hit the floor. He thrust his arms deep into the dark recesses of the safe, his nails scratching against the cold steel as he hoped to find even a single forgotten sheet of paper. There was nothing but dust and shadow. His heart skipped a beat, a cold, sickening realization dawning on him. Sarah hadn't just been sloppy. She had systematically scrubbed every trace of their financial history. He collapsed into the squeaky swivel chair and flipped open the laptop on the desk. The glow of the screen was blinding in the dim office, casting a ghostly blue light over his haggard features. His fingers hammered against the keys, entering the password for the corporate bank account. When the page finally loaded, a long, scrolling list of outgoing transactions appeared. They were all cryptically marked as technical maintenance. Frank leaned in, his eyes narrowed as he scrutinized the routing numbers and recipient names. None of them were familiar. They were offshore shells, entities with hollow, meaningless names that smelled of fraud. Every line represented a sum Sarah had bled from the business over the course of months, a slow, calculated drain that had left him with nothing. He watched the final balance flicker on the screen, a pitiful few cents. His eyes burned from the strain and the shock as the full scale of the theft became clear. Under the guise of keeping the lights on, she had hollowed him out from the inside. He began tearing through the desk drawers, eventually finding a stack of old receipts. Tucked beneath them in the back of Sarah's personal drawer was a folder of printed emails. Frank began to read, the words blurring as his brain struggled to accept the betrayal. The messages were addressed to a man he didn't know, detailing a meticulous plan to bankrupt the shop. He saw the dates. Some of them coincided with anniversaries and birthdays, moments when she had sat across from him, smiling and toast to their future. The emails discussed one-way tickets and the final wire transfer that was timed to hit just before the bailiffs arrived. A wave of nausea rolled over him as he hit a specific sentence where Sarah remarked that Frank was too trusting to ever notice the leak. The paper crumpled in his fist, the physical manifestation of her lies turning into a jagged ball of trash. The woman he had loved had treated his life like a carcass to be picked clean. The lead bailiff snapped his folders shut and gave a sharp nod to the guards. It was the signal to clear the premises. Two of the armored men moved in, grabbing Frank by the elbows. They hauled him toward the exit, ignoring his weak, uncoordinated attempts to break free. His boots scraped across the concrete threshold, leaving faint scuffs that marked his final moments inside the building. The guards shoved him roughly out into the October chill. He stumbled, catching his balance just as the heavy iron doors slammed shut with a finality that felt like a tomb closing. The bailiff stepped forward, hanging a massive padlock on the hasp and pressing a paper seal over the keyhole. The adhesive was bright and white against the rusted metal. Frank stood on the cracked sidewalk, his chest heaving, as he watched the men in uniform pile into their black SUVs and drive away. Youngstown's gray haze seemed to tighten around him, a suffocating fog that severed his connection to everything he owned. Frank remained frozen before the locked gates. He didn't feel the freezing rain as it began to needle his face, nor did he hear the distant hum of the city. He just stared at the seal, a man standing in the ruins of a life he no longer recognized. Frank hit the front door of their apartment with the force of a wrecking ball. The frame groaned, and the wood splintered as the door flew back, slamming into the hallway wall with a crash that shook the pictures in the neighboring units. The air in the bedroom was thick with the smell of lavender and panic. Sarah was on her knees in the center of the room, a large leather suitcase yawning open before her. She was frantically shoving silk dresses into the space, her movements jerky and desperate. The delicate fabric of an emerald gown hissed and tore as she forced it between a pair of heels. Frank stood in the doorway, his eyes taking in the chaos. Scattered makeup, overturned jewelry boxes, and the skeletal remains of her wardrobe hanging in the open closet. She didn't even turn around to look at him, but he saw her shoulders bunch up, her breathing coming in sharp, shallow hitches. The scent of her expensive perfume, the one he'd bought her for Christmas, clashed with the stench of burnt rubber and old grease that clung to his skin. Sarah suddenly bolted upright and spun around to face him. In her clenched fist, she held a pearl necklace, the wire strained to the breaking point. Her eyes, usually so soft, now glittered with the cold, hard light of anthracite. She didn't wait for him to speak. She spat out the name Gary Miller, and the sound of it hit Frank like a physical blow. With a voice that held no trace of the woman he thought he knew, she confessed to everything. She had spent months funneling internal documents to Miller's corporation, providing the legal ammunition they needed to condemn the property and force the sale. Frank saw a triumphant, ugly smirk touch her lips, an expression that lacked any hint of the warmth they had shared for a decade. She reached down and snatched a heavy folder bearing Miller's corporate logo, heaving it at Frank's feet. The binder burst on impact, scattering blueprints and site plans across the floor. Frank stared down at the drawings. They showed a sleek, modern shopping complex sitting exactly where his father's machine stood. He felt a cold, dead weight settle in his gut. A heavy, polished shoe stepped onto the scattered documents, and the doorway was suddenly filled by the looming presence of Gary Miller. He was dressed in a suit the color of wet asphalt, every crease sharp enough to cut. Behind him stood two massive men, their eyes hidden behind dark lenses, their arms crossed over expansive chests. Miller took a slow, theatrical moment to pull a gold-plated pen and a stack of legal papers from his inner pocket. With a smirk that didn't reach his gray, predatory eyes, he held out a contract for the sale of the land. Frank glanced at the figure on the bottom line, It was a pittance, a deliberate insult that wouldn't even cover a fraction of the IRS debt Sarah had manufactured. Miller didn't say a word, but he slowly tapped the face of his Rolex, the rhythmic tink-tink-tink of his fingernail on the crystal, signaling that Frank's life was being measured in seconds. Miller turned to leave, but as he passed, he deliberately slammed his shoulder into Frank's chest. The impact was calculated, a final assertion of dominance. Frank caught the scent of high-end cologne and stale cigar smoke as Miller leaned in close. He whispered a single vile comment about Sarah. Something private, something that implied he had owned more than just her loyalty. The rage that had been simmering in Frank's chest finally boiled over. His fist clenched instinctively and swung in a tight, brutal arc, connecting squarely with Miller's jaw. There was a sickening crack as bone met bone. Miller's head snapped back, and a spray of bright red blood splattered across his pristine white shirt. At that exact moment, the hallway was flooded with a staccato flash of red and blue lights. A sharp police whistle cut through the air of the courtyard outside. Miller slumped against his bodyguard, wiping a hand across his bloody mouth, his eyes wide and gleaming with a dark, satisfied joy. The cold bite of steel ratcheted shut around Frank's wrists. Two officers shoved him forward, pinning his face against the rain-slicked hood of a patrol car. The metal chilled his cheek, and the rough, impersonal hands of the law patted down his pockets, a final violation of his dignity. They threw him into the back of the cruiser, a space that smelled of cheap pine air freshener and old, unwashed upholstery. At the station, he was processed and shoved into a holding cell. He sat on a sticky wooden bench, the only sound the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of a leaking faucet in the corner. The walls were a mosaic of scratched names and dates, a testament to the city's steady supply of the broken and the desperate. He spent hours staring at the cracks in the ceiling, tracing the patterns of decay, until the heavy clatter of the cell door announced his temporary release on bail. Frank stepped out onto the precinct steps, and a gust of wind caught a wet newspaper, slapping it against his shins. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a persistent, annoying buzz. He pulled it out to find an email notification from his bank. The bold text informed him that all his credit lines had been summarily canceled. The letter was a masterpiece of cold, corporate finality. The bank demanded full repayment of all outstanding balances within 10 days. He saw the list of frozen accounts and realized Miller had effectively severed his last lifeline. His fingers went numb as he scrolled, the screen blurring under the light rain until the numbers became illegible. He wasn't just in trouble. He was officially a ghost in the financial system. He drove to the other side of town, pulling up to the heavy oak doors of Bill's garage. Bill had been his father's apprentice, a man Frank had known since he was a boy. Through the frosted glass of the office window, Frank saw Bill's silhouette. The man froze for a second, then reached up and abruptly killed the lights. Frank visited 3 more shops that hour. At each one, he was met with lowered blinds and the palpable scent of fear. Former colleagues and friends avoided his gaze, talking to him through locked chain-link fences, if they talked at all. One mechanic, a man Frank had helped out of a jam just last year, leaned in and whispered that Miller's people had promised to burn down anyone who offered Frank a hand. Frank stood in the middle of the street, his hands empty and shaking, as the doors of the community he had served for 20 years slammed shut one by one. He climbed back into his old pickup and turned the key. The engine had barely turned over when the rearview mirror was filled with the blinding flash of light bars. A police SUV pulled out from an alley, tailing him so closely he could hear the hum of its tires. The officer used the loudspeaker to order him to the curb for a faulty taillight. Frank stared at the citation, the fine amount nearly doubling the value of the truck itself. 2 blocks later, a different patrol car pulled him over for impeding the flow of traffic. He watched the officers smirk as they entered his information into their tablets. Every mile he drove became a gauntlet of harassment, a systematic hunting of a man who had nowhere left to go. Frank pushed open the heavy door of a windowless bar on the edge of the industrial flats. A thick, suffocating cloud of blue tobacco smoke rolled over him. In the back, under a single dim bulb that hummed with a low frequency, sat Slick Joe. The man was slowly shuffling a deck of greasy, dog-eared cards. Frank walked past the rows of slumped, silent drinkers, feeling their suspicious eyes tracking his movement. Joe looked up, his face a map of old scars and hard choices, his lips twisting into a predatory grin. The smell of cheap rye and rancid frying oil seemed to radiate from the man's clothes. Frank sat down, his hands sticking slightly to the tacky surface of the table. Joe leaned back, silent, waiting for the smell of desperation to force Frank to speak first. Slick Joe reached into his coat and produced a thick stack of $100 bills, the bundle held together by a grimy, overstretched rubber band. He slid it across the table alongside a set of keys to a corrugated metal box in the abandoned rail yards. Joe didn't mince words. He needed a mechanic who could work fast and keep his mouth shut. Someone to scrub the identities of high-end imports. Frank stared at the money. It smelled of mildew and something sharp, like cordite. Joe explained that Frank would have to become a ghost, a man who lived in the shadows and breathed life into stolen iron. Frank felt the crushing weight of the choice, but as he looked at the money, he saw Gary Miller's smug face. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he covered the stack of cash. He pulled it toward him, and in that moment, the man his father had raised died. Joe leaned in and slid a battered blue folder across the table. It bore the seal of the Youngstown City Council. Inside, Frank found photocopies of wire transfers, bribes Miller had paid to key officials to grease the wheels of his redevelopment project. There were lists of building inspectors on the payroll and maps showing where zoning laws had been illegally bypassed. Joe pointed to a series of signatures that were never meant to see the light of day. The information felt hot against Frank's fingers, a weapon more powerful than any wrench. He studied the demolition schedules, realizing Miller had already sold the city's future for a profit. The rage in Frank's chest cooled into something sharper and more dangerous. He looked up at Joe, who was watching him with a look of dark amusement. Frank stepped out of the bar, the weight of the cash in his pocket a heavy, constant presence. The freezing wind didn't feel like an enemy anymore. It felt like a whetstone, sharpening his resolve. He looked at his hands, the grease beneath his nails a permanent stain from a life of honest work. And he vowed that these fingers would dismantle Miller's empire, brick by brick. He would play by Miller's rules: dirt, lies, and leverage. The workshop was no longer just a business. It was the first piece on a chessboard he was finally learning to play. He climbed into his truck and slammed the gear into drive, the tires chirping as he sped away. Frank squeezed through the narrow gap of the basement window, the rough, crumbling plaster of the foundation scraping against his spine. The air in the City Hall archives was stagnant, heavy with the smell of decaying paper and decades of dust. He froze as the thin beam of his flashlight swept across rows of gray, anonymous folders. His fingers, still stained with the work from Joe's shop, moved with a frantic rhythm until they snagged on a file labeled Demolition District Forjas. He spread the blueprints across a nearby table. There, next to the mayor's flamboyant signature, was the deep blue ink of a shell company owned by Gary Miller. The camera on his phone clicked rhythmically, the flash reflecting off the evidence of a criminal conspiracy. The documents detailed a plan to bleed the city dry, and as Frank scrolled through the images on his screen, The sheer audacity of the theft made his breath hitch in the silence. He was heading back to the shop, the engine of his pickup humming low, when he approached a sharp bend overlooking the valley. He pressed the brake pedal, but it didn't resist. It slammed to the floor with a hollow, metallic clack. The truck surged forward, gravity and momentum pulling it toward a jagged concrete embankment. Frank yanked the emergency brake, the cable screaming as the rear wheels locked, and the smell of scorched rubber filled the cab. The truck skidded sideways, the passenger side missing the stone wall by a hair's breadth. Frank tumbled out of the cab, his legs shaking, and crawled under the chassis. Rainbow-colored streaks of brake fluid were already pooling on the asphalt, dripping from hoses that had been sliced with surgical precision. He gripped his fists until his knuckles turned white, staring at the clean cuts. Miller wasn't just trying to take his land anymore. He was trying to take his life. The night was a heavy shroud as Frank approached the rear of the workshop. He saw 3 shifting silhouettes near the main bay, the sharp, chemical stench of gasoline hitting him before he saw the cans. One of Miller's thugs tipped a plastic jug, the fuel glugging as it soaked into the wooden threshold. Frank didn't shout. He gripped a heavy, 30-inch pipe wrench, the cold steel feeling like an extension of his arm. He lunged. The first blow caught the lead man in the shoulder, the impact echoing with a wet thud that turned into a scream of pain. Frank dodged a frantic knife thrust, the blade whistling inches from his throat. The adrenaline of a cornered animal surged through him, and he delivered a crushing hook to the second man's jaw. The sound of breaking bone punctuated the darkness as he drove them back. A whirlwind of desperate violence that kept the fire from touching the walls. Thick, oily plumes of black smoke began to billow from the upper vents, the heat of a small fire already searing Frank's lungs. He yanked his collar over his nose and dove into the center of the bay. In the corner, the 1967 Shelby Mustang sat under a layer of soot, the flames already licking at its tires. Frank dropped to his knees, his eyes watering as he fumbled for the keys in the ignition. The engine erupted into a thunderous, guttural roar that drowned out the crackle of the burning rafters. He slammed the car into gear, the tires screaming as they tore through the soot on the floor. The Mustang surged forward, a blue streak of power that smashed through the weakened, flaming doors in a spectacular spray of sparks and embers. Frank brought the car to a halt a block away, coughing violently as he wiped the grime from his face, looking back at the glowing skeleton of his father's dream. The next morning, Frank stood in the ruins, the white foam from an extinguisher coating the charred remains of his desk. As the dust settled, he noticed a sliver of glossy paper protruding from a pile of ash. He picked up the singed photograph. It was Sarah, her smiling face half-eaten by the fire. The soot stained his fingers like ink, and a bitter, hard knot formed in his throat. He looked at her empty, burned-out eyes, remembering the way she used to whisper about their future while she was signing the papers that would burn it all down. He didn't feel sadness, only a cold, hollow clarity. He opened his hand, letting the charred remains of her image flutter down to be trampled into the gray dust beneath his boots. His phone shrieked in the silence, a jarring sound that made his skin crawl. Sarah's voice on the other end was as cold and sharp as a razor. She didn't offer apologies. She read from a prepared script. She detailed a domestic violence report she had filed, a fabrication of bruises and threats that would turn him into a pariah. She told him that he had until dawn to sign over the land, or the police would be there to ensure he spent the next decade in a cell. Frank listened to her icy, measured tone, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. She hung up without waiting for a response, leaving him in a silence that was broken only by the frantic pounding of his own heart. He was being erased, piece by piece, He met the other property owners in the damp, mildew-scented basement of an old church. A single bare bulb swung above them, casting long, nervous shadows. Frank stood before them, his voice raw as he showed them the photos of the bribes and the illegal demolition orders. He called for a strike, for a unified front against the corporation. But all he saw were hunched shoulders and eyes that wouldn't meet his. An old mechanic, a man who had worked the flats for 40 years, turned away, hiding hands that shook with a palsy of fear. The silence in the room became a physical weight. Frank realized that Miller's reach wasn't just in the pockets of the politicians. It was in the marrow of these men's bones. They were already defeated. Bill, his oldest friend, stepped forward and handed him a crumpled notice from a collection agency. He whispered that Miller had bought up every outstanding debt in the district. He didn't just want the land. He owned the people on it. Frank read the threats of immediate eviction and the seizure of family homes. Bill's eyes were wet with a helpless, burning shame as he spoke of the men who had visited his house at night to talk about his children. Frank looked around the room and saw the same story on every face. Miller had tightened the noose, and the neighborhood was gasping its last. The unified front he had hoped for was nothing more than a gathering of the condemned. Frank returned to the shop and began hauling stacks of old tires into the entryway. The scent of sulfur and heavy rubber filled the air as he worked. He hammered long steel stakes into the door frames, securing heavy sheets of corrugated iron across the openings. Sweat stung his eyes as he winced against the pain in his ribs, stacking engine blocks and heavy workbenches into a jagged wall of metal. The workshop was no longer a place of business. It was a fortress of rusted iron and desperation. He checked the bolts on the barricade, feeling the floor vibrate as the distant hum of the city began to fade. He looked at his handiwork, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He was done running. He knelt on the oily floor and pried up a loose, blackened board. Beneath it lay a bundle wrapped in heavy, oil-soaked burlap. He unwrapped his father's old double-barreled shotgun, the metal cold and comforting in his hands. He took a rag and began to clean the barrels, his movements slow and methodical, a ritual that calmed the tremors in his fingers. He worked until the steel shone like a dark mirror. With a sharp, authoritative clack, he snapped the action shut, the sound echoing through the hollow shop. He loaded 2 heavy shells into the chambers, the scent of gun oil acting as a balm to his frayed nerves. He sat back against the wall, the weapon resting across his lap, a man waiting for the end of the world. He reached over and flipped the switch on an old shortwave radio station he'd rigged to the shop's antenna. The speaker hissed with the static of the void before he pulled the microphone to his lips. He began to speak, his voice low and steady, a sharp contrast to the chaos of the night. He read the names of the councilmen, the amounts of the bribes, and the locations of the offshore accounts Sarah had used. He described the sabotage of his truck and the names of the men who had come to burn his legacy. He knew the signal was being picked up by scanners and late-night listeners across the county. He was burning every bridge he had ever built, casting a final, blinding light on the rot at the heart of Youngstown. When he finished, he clicked the mic off, the red transmission light fading into the darkness. Frank sat on the cold concrete by the barricaded door, the stock of the shotgun pressed firmly against his shoulder. Through a narrow slit in the iron, he watched the darkness of the alleyway. Suddenly, 2 muzzled, matted white beams of light cut through the gloom. The low, aggressive growl of Miller's SUVs grew louder, a mechanical predator approaching its prey. The vibration of the engines made the tools on the walls rattle in their racks. He saw the silhouettes of men stepping out of the vehicles, the glint of weapons reflecting the moonlight. A spotlight hit the front of the shop, the glare leaking through the cracks in his armor and illuminating his face. Frank took a long, slow breath. tasting the dust and the promise of gunpowder. He didn't move as the first shadow touched the threshold. Frank pressed his eye against the jagged gap between the steel plates covering the window. The pre-dawn sky was a bruised, sickly blue, but the stillness was shattered by the high-pitched scream of high-performance brakes. 3 black SUVs, their paint gleaming like beetle shells, slid into a tight semicircle in front of the shop, kicking up plumes of gray gravel. Behind them, the white vans of the bailiff's office rolled to a stop, their doors slamming with a sound like synchronized gunfire. Frank watched Gary Miller step out, his polished shoes crunching into a muddy puddle without a flicker of concern. The bailiffs followed, their reflective vests glowing in the dim light as they began to deploy. The air outside was quickly choked with the heavy, acrid smell of diesel exhaust from the idling engines. Miller took a heavy, industrial megaphone from one of his guards. He licked his lips, his eyes fixed on the barricaded door, and pulled the trigger on the device. A sharp, electronic squeal pierced the air before his voice, distorted and metallic, began to boom against the brick walls. He sounded like a god of the new world, demanding that Frank drop his weapon and emerge with his hands up. He promised a decade in a cage for every minute Frank delayed, his tone a mixture of boredom and malice. Through the slit, Frank saw Miller casually check his cuffs and then his watch, giving a lazy, downward signal to a man holding a heavy battering ram. The clock on Frank's life had finally run down to the last few ticks. The side door of the shop groaned as Frank threw back the heavy iron bolt. Instead of the expected volley of fire, the courtyard was suddenly filled with a low, primeval throb, the sound of 8 cylinders waking up in a fury. Frank eased the Shelby Mustang out of the bay, its cobalt blue paint catching the first true rays of the sun. The chrome on the bumper was so bright, it forced Miller to shield his eyes. The white racing stripes on the hood looked like twin lances aimed directly at the heart of the blockade. The bailiffs froze, their hands hovering near their holsters, mesmerized by the sheer, restored beauty of the machine. Frank cut the engine, and the ensuing silence was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the cooling metal as he stared down the men who had come to erase him. A long, slender shadow stretched across the gravel as a silver limousine glided to a halt behind the SUVs. A man stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate, dressed in a tailored camel hair coat and gloves so thin they looked like a second skin. He was a ghost of old money, a collector Frank had contacted through Joe. The old man walked a slow circle around the Mustang, his fingers barely brushing the radiator grill as if he were touching a holy relic. Frank watched him listen to the car's heat-pitting metal, a small, satisfied nod the only sign of his approval. The collector pulled a leather-bound checkbook from his breast pocket and began to write. He handed the slip of paper to Frank. It smelled of expensive ink and the quiet power of a bank vault. Looking at the number, Frank felt the crushing weight of the IRS debt simply vanish into the morning air. Frank stepped toward the lead bailiff, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel. He ignored the guards who leveled their rifles at his chest, his gaze fixed on the official. He held out a thick stack of fresh bank receipts and a wire transfer confirmation bearing the embossed gold seal of a Tier 1 bank. The bailiff took the papers, his eyebrows climbing toward his hairline as he scanned the figures. Frank jabbed a grease-stained finger at the statute on the second page, the one that mandated the immediate release of all seized assets upon full satisfaction of the debt. Miller lunged forward, his face contorted as he tried to snatch the papers. But the bailiff stepped in his way, a firm hand to Miller's chest. For the first time in weeks, Frank felt the blood returning to his fingers. The noose hadn't just loosened, it had snapped. Miller's face turned a violent, raw shade of crimson. He spun toward his guards, his arm rising in a jagged motion as he prepared to order them to take the shop by force. Before he could speak, Frank dove back into the Mustang and emerged with the blue folder from the city archives. He held it high, shaking it so the photographs of Miller passing thick envelopes to the mayor fell like confetti onto the wet gravel. Miller froze, his arm still raised, his jaw beginning to work in a frantic, silent tremor. The guards looked at each other, their grip on their weapons faltering as they realized the man paying them was no longer the one in charge. A gust of wind caught a ledger sheet bearing Miller's signature and tumbled it across the ground, right into the hands of the bailiffs. A nondescript gray sedan rounded the corner, its tires whispering on the asphalt. A man in a dark, heavy overcoat stepped out, holding a gold shield that caught the light with a dull, authoritative glint. The crowd parted like a sea as the federal agent approached. Frank handed him the rest of the folder, the rough plastic of the cover sliding away, with a sense of immense relief. The agent flipped through the records of Miller's offshore accounts, giving Frank a short, sharp nod of acknowledgement. The radio broadcast had done its work. The feds had been waiting for the physical proof. The agent pulled a radio from his belt and spoke a few clipped words. The air around Miller seemed to solidify, the very laws he had twisted now tightening around him like a shroud. The local cops, who had been laughing in the shadows just minutes before, began to back toward their cruisers, their faces pale with the sudden realization of their own exposure. The federal agents moved with a cold, practiced efficiency, spinning Miller around and slamming him against the hood of his own SUV. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was a bright, metallic chime in the morning air. Miller's expensive suit bunched and wrinkled under the agent's grip, and his polished shoes skidded uselessly in an oil slick. He tried to roar a protest, but his head was forced down as he was shoved into the back of a black van. Frank stood on the threshold of his shop, his arms crossed, watching the corporate titan be hauled away like common trash. The door of the remaining SUV flew open, and Sarah stumbled out. She ran toward Frank, her heels slipping on the gravel, her face a mask of ruined makeup and desperation. She tried to grab his shoulders, her voice a series of broken, hysterical sobs. She began a frantic, rambling explanation about how Miller had threatened her, how she had only done it to protect them both. Frank smelled her perfume, the same scent that had lingered in the office after the fire, and it turned his stomach. He looked into her eyes, searching for the woman he had married, but he found only a stranger who had set fire to his life for a profit. He remained as still and cold as the iron of his machines. Frank reached up and slowly, methodically unpeeled her fingers from his jacket. He didn't say a word, his silence a more devastating verdict than any shout. He extended his arm and pointed toward the end of the alley, toward the broken road that led out of the district. Sarah froze, her mouth hanging open as she realized the depth of the void between them. She began to back away, her heel catching on a discarded flyer as she retreated into the gray Youngstown morning. Frank turned his back on her and gripped the handle of the gate. The heavy steel door swung shut with a final, echoing thud, severing the last tie to the life he had known. He heard the fading sound of her footsteps, a lonely rhythm that was soon swallowed by the awakening city. Bill and the other mechanics began to emerge from the shadows of their own shops, their movements hesitant at first. Seeing that the black SUVs were gone, Bill picked up a discarded shovel and began to scrape the charred, blackened plaster from Frank's entryway. The other men followed, bringing buckets of soapy water and stiff brushes to scrub the soot from the brickwork. Frank watched as the shared labor began to wash away the layer of fear that had paralyzed the neighborhood. Bill clapped him on the shoulder, a heavy, silent gesture that signaled the return of a brotherhood Frank thought was lost forever. Together, they began to haul the heavy engine blocks and barricades away, clearing a path for the sunlight that was finally pouring onto the workshop floor. Frank stepped into the center of the bay, pulling off his charred jacket. He reached for his old grease-stained coveralls and slid them on, the familiar weight of the fabric a comfort against his skin. He felt a sense of gravity he hadn't known in years. He reached out and picked up a massive 30-inch pipe wrench from the bench, his fingers curling around the handle as if it were a scepter. The cold steel fit perfectly into the calluses of his palm. He looked at the shop, at the men working beside him, and at the tools waiting for his command. He didn't look back. He simply went to work. The end. Do not proceed past this point.